Hello, Internet. Welcome to another Wednesday serial. This is going to be mostly talking in and around about an article I read on Polygon that I'm guessing some of you have read too. It seemed to have got some legs. It was the title being The Writer Who Made Me Love Comics and Taught Me to Hate Them, which is an article about Frank Miller. It's by Susana Polo, which is interesting to me, partially because this is on Polygon, and she's apparently the founder of the Mary Sue. So why is she writing for a different site? I don't understand. I guess it's how you make it writing about these things. I really want to point that out, though, because I want to make this very clear that I understand that she's a very well-known person in these circles, and I fully believe she has read well beyond what she talks about in this article, but I feel like the lack of her talking about certain titles paints an odd picture, and it's an odd omission. That's kind of what I want to get to. So, a lot of this article is her take on when she read and ingested these different Frank Miller works, and then how she responded to them at the time. The first one for her was Batman Year One. She read when she was 11, apparently, and this was a comic book that just grabbed her in a way that I think was really kind of the first comic that she really chose to read, and it just captured her imagination. I imagine it led to her reading a great number of other things. It was kind of the impression she wanted to give. And then she talks about how a year later she's reading The Dark Knight Returns and it scares her. Batman's using guns, and the Joker calls him by pet names, things like that. But there's some weird stuff that she doesn't like, but she lets it slide because that's apparently her impression is that's how the book is supposed to be. Yeah. Then she's talking about being 15 and starting to look at colleges. I don't want to put too much on that, but there's something oddly telling to that about me. Because this whole article is about her mindset. 15 looking at colleges shows a matter of affluence that isn't normally associated with the idea of comics being counterculture, that we're still kind of where comics were at the time. Because she's pinning this around the time she's reading The Dark Knight Strikes Again. I imagine this is about the time it's coming out. So I don't know. It's not that it should matter where someone's at reading the comic. It's how it matters to them, but a matter of perception. Like, I know a big reason why a lot of people kind of come into comics and found certain things about Frank Miller's work enjoyable was the fact that they kind of viewed themselves as a bit of an outsider. But what's interesting is she's striking the point that a lot of the villains, especially when she gets to talking about Sin City, where she's apparently 18. The movie, though, not the comics, but she also kind of comes back to the comics. A lot of those villains that we see in these big Frank Miller works are maybe having odd sexual tendencies, ranging from gay, which isn't even that odd anymore, right? But was kind of viewed as queer. That's the idea back more in the day, versus more to where we see in Sin City with straight up like pedophilia and weird, bad stuff. Also coupled with this idea of this straight macho male needing to, protect the female, but also seeing women only as victims or whores, which we get a lot in the Millerverse, which I see and I understand. then she continues through with All-Star Batman Robin 1, where they're talking about Vicky Vale, who's, complaining about Bruce Wayne, but the minute that Alfred calls to say Bruce wants to go on a date with her, she's, getting herself all dolled up and, super. And she says it's the first time she decides a Batman story isn't worth reading. Look, there's no defense for All Stars Batman because. But then she talks about Holy Terror and how that's supposed to be a Batman book, but then it comes back and it's this kind of weird jingoistic thing. And I mean, I get the hate for that book, but I also am still shocked to this day that there wasn't more of that hoorah cowboy response in pop culture to what happened during September 11th. And frankly, I think that kind of art needed to be made by some people for some people, and I think it was a predictable but necessary reaction. I get why people come down on it, but there's also a reason DC didn't publish it and they had to pull Batman out of that whole thing. And Batman's a terrible choice for that sort of a work. So I don't know, but it was a interesting point for her, and this is just, again at 19 for her. But then she gets to a point that is what struck me. She talks about his Daredevil run. She talks about how in a single volume, which is odd because the volumes I have are broken up differently apparently. That's neither here nor there though. But she's talking about how Elektra is introduced, glorified, and then murdered. And essentially not just murdered, but fridged, killed in order to continue the male narrative story as a kind of, galvanizing moment, which, yes, but, and this is a huge, huge but, kind of like mine. Elektra was killed off. She was fridged. But then you have to remember this was before that was like a common problem. This isn't the first time it happened, even to a comic book character, but she wasn't like Gwen Stacy. She was truly an equal. The fact that Bullseye took down Elektra was shocking because it seemed like by all rights Elektra should have been able to kick his ass. And then Frank Miller spent a good chunk of time after that writing her back in with various comics that were never received quite as well as that Daredevil run for sure. But there's a great body of work he did with Elektra, and I think in a way, I don't know if it says he regrets it or if it was a mistake or anything like that, but this was comic books, and she did come back in a big way. She's a major character in the Marvel Universe and brought back. And I know that doesn't necessarily matter as much, but I think what does matter here is that was the story that he penned at the time, and there was something about Daredevil, especially at the time, that was singular. It was powerful. It was unquestionably a great work. And now we look back on it, I think it's fine to say this part wasn't great. But that's not the message we're getting. We're getting this kind of narrative about Frank Miller being this misogynist and this, right wing, red blooded American, that the more liberal take, which, I mean, frankly, if we're going to be talking the comic book populace, is the high majority, doesn't sit well with them. But I don't know. And she's talking about how, Frank Miller kind of became this character, this creator rather, that isn't so great. And it kind of belies the influence and the importance that he's had on the industry. And I've certainly gone off on some of this. I've talked about how I think, the whole Dark Knight Rises bit is totally overplayed, how I think the art in that is overstated, how these things are overwrought. Uh, but I'll also defend that Daredevil art to death. But if we're going to be talking about Frank Miller as a creator, we also really have to remember that he did a lot more than all of that. Uh, I mean, 300 is another thing she brings up, and I think that's a great point for, historical accuracy and how poorly that's portrayed. And that's fair, but at the same time, before that, how many comics did we have really kind of examining historical events, in this historical fiction sort of sense, even? I don't think it was as much. I think that kind of opened a gate for good or ill. These first steps are sketchy. Same thing with Sin City, in the context of its time. Sure, we look at the gender politics now, but I mean, it's Sin City. It's supposed to be in that dark area. And I mean, yeah, it's kind of reprehensible, but that's kind of the point. And we were still coming out of dealing with, the code on comics. And yeah, it was an immature look at sexuality, but those were some of the first early steps we needed. I mean, frankly, seeing a nipple in comics was a big deal still at that point. And those were there, and if you're going to be talking about sexuality, yeah, we had to be immature before we could even look at being mature. And that book was certainly a big point for all of that. But I mean, we also have to remember, I mean, at top of all that other stuff, he did Daredevil Man Without Fear. He really restructured the character. And more importantly than all that, he did Ronin, which is still a hugely important work and has dictated more than anything else kind of this art style that's flown through with comics and just is such an indispensable work. And more than that, I mean, we can talk about the narrative and where things were, but what Frank Miller did for the page, what Frank Miller did for kind of having something central for people to focus on with comics at the time. I mean, yes, any creator, over time is going to wane. Any creator's going to put out some bad stuff. Any creator's going to have better successes with you than the public, and vice versa, if they have enough time to develop the kind of body of work he has. But for good or ill, his voice in the world of comics has created a space so that we have people that kind of align and dissent with it. And the world of comics is ultimately richer for all of his works, all the way from Batman Year One down to Holy Terror. If we're gonna look at an icon's impact on the medium with someone that has had such a huge stamp on it for so many years, I think it's insane for anyone to take it as all good, which is something that I think people have been reacting to for a long time. But I also think we have a narrative now of coming down on him being overly negative. And the truth is always is somewhere in the middle. And I think if we're really going to look at it, if we're going to be examining these things and our interpretation of it, we really need to find the good and the bad and the beyond, find what beyond just our reaction, but see where that influence has put us. And I, for someone who has as much status as she does talking about these things, I, I find it a little unsettling that I guess we're just so reactionary to things now on that level of media. Um, she writes a lot of great pieces, but this one just left me wanting more because I knew there was more to the story, more to his work, and we all have to keep reading and keep growing on it. But I just know that as I've gotten a little bit older and I've read through so much more, my opinion of this man has changed like 5 times over. And then reading about him and reading his entries and whatnot, you know, he's a person like anyone else, and he's an artist. I mean, you think of this gruff, macho exterior, but he's a guy hunched over a desk with a pen. I I don't know. At least that was pretty much where my thought process was until I kind of came at it from the other side. I'm like, is there some creator I just seem to despise, despite reasons that I probably should like them a bit more? And the person that came to mind was recently Charles Soule. Um, I have some friends who really like his work, and I've tried reading some of his comics, and every time I do, it's just lacking. I mean, coming right back to Daredevil, his current run on Daredevil, I find maddening. I think it's poor writing, it's poor craftsmanship through and through. And I mean, other people are defending it. They think I'm being impatient because the story that's being told just starts him off with prosecution. People don't know who he is anymore, and he has a sidekick that is fighting for illegal immigrants. And I'm not saying Daredevil isn't the kind of character that would not stand up for those who need to be stood up for, but for him to not have any conflict over helping out illegal immigrants as an agent of the law, I find hard to swallow. Again, not because he wouldn't do it, but because he'd have to dig into the situation. He'd have to know the people, and the story has to be told. Otherwise, he's just on this side of it, and that doesn't match the character, especially more now that he's on the prosecution side of things. But again, why is he there? And that's the only thing on my mind when I'm reading these comics. I want to know how he ended up there. That's the only story that should be told. But we're not getting that story. We're just somewhere else. With assuming that all of these three elements tie together, and we're just somewhere else, and we're just supposed to go along with. And I've been accused of being impatient, and that I just need to go along with it, waiting for these things to be explained. But no, any story that's happening now is rubbish. No, why would we care? The only thing we want to know about is why these changes happened. And if we don't get that story, then anything being told is just fluff. It's just a waste of time. Every panel is a waste. Every word, every page is just garbage. So why read it? I don't know. But again, it's all a matter of perspective where you're at. So I guess I'm realizing that I'm too harsh with where maybe this article is coming from. And it's just one of those, me trying to grapple with talking about, these things as art and reviewing books. But I mean, ultimately, it's all just opinions, sometimes despite our best efforts of looking at things from a different point of view that we'd consider to be more educated, maybe, after having read so much. I don't know, it's just kind of odd to kind of compare yourself to someone who's effectively doing it professionally. So, I don't know. Have you guys ever just had a problem with a creator or had a problem with the way someone else was talking about a creator that you just felt was patently wrong and you feel like you have evidence for it even? Um, yeah, I don't know. Just let me know. It was just an interesting churn today with that. So, peace.